Good morning. We're certainly glad that you are with us here today. We have visitors, and we invite you to come back at any time that you might be able to be here. You're certainly and always welcome here at Lower Paw Paw. Old wise tale once said, nobody is perfect. But as we talked about 2 weeks ago when we started this particular study, we found out that wise tale is not really very wise because it is not true. Nobody is perfect, but yet there was one and still is one who is perfect. And there are those who can reach a different type of perfection, a spiritual perfection. Nobody is perfect, but yet Christ was perfect. In Hebrews, the 4th chapter, and in 1 Peter chapter 2, and Hebrews chapter 7, we are told very plainly that Christ had reached a perfection. He was perfect. He was tempted in all points like as we, Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15, yet without sin. In 1 Peter chapter 2, the Apostle Peter teaches us that there was no sin in his life, neither was there any guile found in his mouth. That word guile means deceit. So his perfection was complete. Not only was there no sin in his life, but there was no deceit or deception found in the words that he spoke. He, in other words, spoke and taught the truth. He was perfect in all ways. And yet there is another group that is perfect in a spiritual way. And that is you and I. Now man says in the religious world, and perhaps there are even those in the Lord's church who believe that we cannot reach a perfection. That we cannot reach a spiritual maturity in God. But yet that is not what the Bible teaches. In Philippians, the 3rd chapter, the Apostle Paul teaches us that he had reached a spiritual perfection and that the Philippian Christians had reached a spiritual perfection. Let's just turn there and remind ourselves what the Apostle writes here. In Philippians, the 3rd chapter and verse 15, I'll be reading as I did the last time from the New King James Version of the Bible. And then we're going to switch over to the King James for the rest of our lesson here this morning. But in Philippians, the 3rd chapter and verse 15, the Apostle Paul writes, as we read in the New King James, "Therefore let us, as many as are mature, have this mind, and if anything you think otherwise, God will reveal even this to you. Therefore let us, as many as are mature." Now you look at that in the King James Version, it reads, "as many as are perfect." And the idea behind perfect here is to be perfect or to be complete or to reach a certain maturity in the sight of God. Paul said that maturity is possible. In fact, that maturity had already been reached. Notice the first part of the verse once again. "Therefore let us, as many as are," present tense, "as are mature." There were those at that time that reached that spiritual maturity. Therefore let us. Well, who's included in that? Well, the writer, which would be Paul, to whom he was writing, which would be the Philippian Christians. But it also include those who he is writing to today, which is you and I. And so Paul here is teaching not only did he reach a spiritual perfection, a maturity in the sight of God, and the Philippian Christians, but that you and I can also reach that maturity. But how do we do it? That's the question we left you with a couple of weeks ago. How do we reach that spiritual maturity, that spiritual perfection? Well, there are other examples throughout the Scriptures of those who had reached a complete maturity, a complete spiritual perfection in the sight of God. And if we can just determine how they reached their perfection, then you and I as well, in following their example, can reach that spiritual perfection. Let's go back and let's notice, to begin with, let's notice Noah. Because Noah was one who, unlike all the rest of his generation, Noah was one who had reached a spiritual perfection in the sight of God. Let's go back to Genesis, the 6th chapter. In Genesis chapter 6, in verse 9 of that passage, we are introduced to Noah. Genesis chapter 6, and let's notice what we're told in verse 9. Everybody there? Verse 9. I've now switched to the King James Version of the Bible simply because it's going to read the way that I want to guide the lesson here this morning. Let's notice how we're introduced to Noah. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. Now notice how we are introduced here to Noah. First of all, he was a just man. He was someone who lived justly. But notice that we're also told here, as we read in the King James Version, we're also told that Noah was a just man and he was perfect in his generations. Now what is meant here by perfect in the Hebrew? Well, perfect in the Hebrew comes from tamim, and it means to be complete. It means to reach a certain place. It means to be without blemish. It means to be upright. It means to be perfect. And so he had reached a spiritual completeness in the sight of God. In fact, he had reached a spiritual perfection, especially among the rest of those who lived at that time. In fact, that's exactly what is meant by the phrase there in verse 9. And Noah was a just man and perfect in his generation. That phrase generation in the Hebrew is talking about the people who lived at that particular time, at that particular age, if you will. And compared to them, Noah had reached a spiritual perfection. Now, let's first of all ask the question, what was wrong with everybody else? Well, jump up a few verses, beginning in verse 6. And we'll find out what was wrong with everybody else. Genesis chapter 6, beginning in fact, let's begin in verse 5. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of his thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him in his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast and creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. What was wrong with everybody else? Well, everybody else stopped following God. Everybody else stopped obeying him. In fact, they started to live wickedly in the sight of God, but not Noah. You see, Noah was a just man, and Noah was perfect in his generation. He was perfect in his age. He was perfect among the other men who lived at that time. He had reached a completeness in the sight of God. Now, how did he reach that completeness? You know, we need to follow the example of Noah. So what did Noah do? If you and I do the same thing, then we too can reach a perfection in the sight of God. Well, the men who lived at that time, we said just a moment ago, they stopped following God. But that was not the case with Noah. Noah continued to follow God. Now somebody might ask the question, okay, now where are we told that? Well, verse 9. In the last part of the verse. Let's now read verse 9 in its entirety here. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just and perfect man in his generations, and Noah walked with God. He walked with God. You know what that word walk means? It means very simply to follow. And so he followed God in his life. He obeyed God. Whatever God commanded, in fact, God was going to command him to build an ark, and he even told him how he was to build it. He followed God's commandments completely. And in doing so, he had reached a completed perfection in God's sight. He was perfect in God's sight because he was one who did exactly as God told him to do. And friends, the same thing holds true for you and I today. If we will simply do what God commands us, if we will simply follow Christ, do the things that Christ commands us, then you and I as well can reach a spiritual perfection. We can reach a spiritual maturity just like Paul did. Did Paul follow God? Yes. We can reach a spiritual perfection just like the Philippian Christians did. Did they follow God? Yes. And in doing so, they reached that spiritual maturity. And you and I as well can reach a state of maturity in God's sight if we'll simply do what God tells us to do. The question is, what are you doing? What are you doing? I can't answer that question for you. I can answer it for me. But only you can answer it for yourself. And so look at your life and ask yourself, have I reached a maturity? Am I on that way to reaching a spiritual maturity? If not, maybe I need to obey God in my life. But let's notice someone else. Let's turn to the book of Job. Let's turn to the book of Job. Let's notice the example of Job. Now somebody might say, now wait a minute, Tom, you can't use Job. You can't use him. Why not? Well, he never existed. It's just a story. You ever heard that? I've heard that throughout my life. That Job never really existed. But I believe that he did. In fact, we don't have to go any further than verse 1, and we find out that, yes, Job did exist. So let's turn to Job chapter 1. And let's deal first of all with that problem of proving that Job did exist. Job chapter 1. There was in the land of Oz, Job 1 and 1. There was a man in the land of Oz whose name was Job. Did Job exist? We don't have to go very far into this book, into this chapter, to find out that yes, he did exist. There was. The word was in the Hebrew comes from the Hebrew word haya, which means to exist. To exist. So what's God telling us right off the bat? God is telling us there existed a man in the land of Uz. And then he's very specific about this particular man. He gives us his name, and then he gives us a very complete and full description of the man who lived in the land of Uz. There existed a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was perfect and upright, one that feared God and eschewed evil. What an introduction. What an introduction. God said here that Job was upright. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that Job was one, when it came to his life, he lived things rightly and justly. He was someone who lived in a righteous state. He was upright in the sight of God. And not only that, but notice that God said that he was one who feared God. What that means very simply is that Job had a reverence for God, or he respected God. And he was one who eschewed evil. The word eschew means to turn away from. And so if it was evil, he turned away from it. If it was evil, he avoided it. If it was evil, he abstained from it. What an introduction. But did you notice what else God had said? Let's read this verse once again. Now, we've already noticed that he was upright. We already noticed that he was one who feared God. We already noticed that he was one who eschewed evil. But what else did God have to say? There was a man in the land of Oz whose name was Job, and that man was what? Perfect. That man was perfect. Okay. What does that mean? Well, just like with Noah back in Genesis chapter 6, the idea of perfection here is that he was complete. In fact, the word here in the Hebrew is that he was complete morally. Well, that brings up a good question. Somebody might ask, okay, now was he sinless? In fact, if we look in other translations, I believe that we'll find the word that he was blameless. That he was blameless. New King James reads that way. Other translations read that way. So are we being told here that he was without sin? No. In fact, Job himself, in Job chapter 9, and about verse 20, said that he wasn't someone without sin. Let's just turn to that particular passage. Job chapter 9. And let's notice what Job himself said in verse 20 of that passage. Job said, "If I justify myself, my own mouth shall condemn me. If I say I am perfect, it shall also prove me to be perverse." It'll prove me to be sinful. I like how the contemporary English reads here. The contemporary English in verse 20 says, "Even if I was innocent, God would prove me wrong." God would prove me wrong. He's not telling us, God's not telling us back in chapter 1, verse 1, that he was blameless as without sin. But he was simply one who was blameless. He was simply one who was perfect in that he was complete morally. He was complete morally. Okay, now, that's the type of perfection, that's the type of completeness that we want to obtain. So what did Job do to be complete morally in the sight of God? Well, what did Noah do? Noah obeyed God. Noah was a follower of God. Now let's just stop here and think for just a minute. Does anyone, after reading verse 1, think that Job wasn't a follower of God? Verse 1, I think, implies to us very simply, he was one who followed God. He was perfect. He was upright. He feared God. He eschewed evil. He was someone who followed God. In fact, God himself tells us, just a few verses later, that Job was a follower of his. Notice what we're told in verse 8. In fact, let's begin in verse 6. In verse 6, we're told about a day in which the sons of God gathered together before him. And among those who attended was Satan. Okay, now let me just throw this in here. And if you're curious, go home and study on it. The sons of God gathered before God. Satan was there. Why was Satan there? Because Satan was a son of God. He was a son of God to begin with. And so he gathered there before God. And notice what God had to say to Satan. In fact, let's begin reading in verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro from the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job? We were asking the question, was Job a follower of God? Well, friends, I have no doubt that he was a follower. God said, my servant Job. So he was a follower of God, and because he followed God, he had reached a spiritual perfection. He had reached a spiritual maturity in God's sight because he followed him. He obeyed him in his life. But let's continue reading here. And the Lord said unto Satan, hast thou considered thy servant Job? There is none like him in the earth. A perfect and upright man, one who feared God and eschewed evil. Hast thou considered my servant Job? For there is none like him in the earth. Every time I read that particular passage, I can't help but think, would God say that about any of us? Would God, if he was given the same opportunity, say, that John, there's none like him. Or that David, there's none like him. Or that Harold, there's none like him. Or that Heather, there's none like her. Would he say that about us? Perhaps we need to be looking at our life and try to determine if we are doing the things that Noah did, that we're doing the things that Job did. And perhaps God would say those very things about you and I. What if we had some trouble? Would we be someone who continued to follow God, or would we turn away from it? What if we had some trouble? What if there was a death in our life? Or what if there was financial problems in our life? What if something happened to us? Would we continue to follow as Noah did? Would we continue to follow as Job did? What would we do? You know, Satan thought, in fact, Satan hoped that if all that Job had was taken from him, or if all the things that he had, if God had struck those things, he believed that Job would curse God. Verse 11. And that's what he hoped. He hoped that Job would curse him if God took away all the things that he had. Would you and I curse him if trouble had entered into our life? And troubles did come in Job's life, didn't it? In the matter of one day, Job lost almost everything. In a matter of one day. Beginning in verse 13. And there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house. And there came a messenger unto Job and said, the oxen were plowing, and the asses feeding beside of them. And the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them away. Yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came also another servant, and said, the fire of God is fallen from heaven, and hath burned up the sheep and the servants, and consumed them, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. And as he was yet speaking, there came also another, and said, the Chaldeans made out 3 bands, fell upon the camels, and have carried them away. And yea, have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. And while he was yet speaking, there also came another, and said, thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness, and smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead, and I am only escaped alone to tell thee. All of these things, his livestock, his servants, his children, all of them in one day perished. Satan said in verse 11, he's going to curse you, God. He's going to turn against you. He's going to turn away from you. But what did Job do? Did he continue to follow God? Or did he curse him and turn away from him? Well, in Job chapter 1 and verse 21. Job said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return hither. The Lord gave, and the Lord have taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Satan said he's going to curse you. But instead, Job said, blessed be the name of the Lord. Instead of cursing and turning away from it, he praised God. Well, there came another occasion in which Satan was before God. In chapter 2. Notice what God continued to say about his servant Job. And the Lord said, verse 2, and the Lord said unto Satan, from whence comest thou? And Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, hast thou considered my servant Job? That there is none like him in all the earth. All of these things happen, and yet there is still none like him in all of the earth. He didn't turn away. He continued to follow. There's none like him in all of the earth. A perfect and upright man, one who feareth God and escheweth evil, and still he holdeth fast his integrity. Still he holdeth fast his integrity. Still he holdeth fast his perfection, is the meaning behind the word integrity. Still he held fast to that spiritual perfection, that spiritual completeness, that spiritual maturity that he had reached. He held fast to that. He reached that point because he was someone who followed God. Even in times of trouble, even in times of trial, he continued to follow him. And friends, if you and I will simply do the same, if we will continue to follow God, if we will obey God in our life, then like Paul, like the Philippian Christians, we too can be spiritually mature. We can reach that perfection. And there's more that the Bible has to say about it. And it is here that we'll pick up the next time. We want to extend the invitation. If we have anyone here this morning who needs to come in obedience of the gospel of Jesus Christ, then friends, we encourage you to come here this morning. If you have erred in your faith in some way, then why not come and make things right? We stand ready to help you, whatever your spiritual need may be. So why not come? Why together we stand and we sing.